The day I discovered what my daughter-in-law had done with the money, I was standing in the driveway of the house I had just signed over to them, holding a receipt for $43,000 in renovation costs I had paid the week before. I read the figure twice. Then I folded the paper and put it in my shirt pocket and stood there for a long moment, looking at the front door that I had chosen, the garden bed along the path that I had planted, the letterbox I had installed on a Saturday morning in April, while my son watched from the porch drinking a cup of tea I had made for him. My name is Raymond Ashford. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for a civil firm in Auckland, and before that, 2 years on construction sites in Christchurch, learning what concrete and steel actually do when the ground moves. I retired early because my wife, Patricia, wanted to see the South Island properly before her knees gave out entirely. We made it as far as Queenstown before she was diagnosed. She passed 14 months later. That was 4 years ago now. My son Callum is 34. He is our only child. When Patricia was sick, Callum drove down from Hamilton every second weekend without fail. And I loved him for that. In a way I could not have articulated then, and still cannot fully articulate now. What I can say is that after Patricia died, I made Callum a promise. Not out loud, not in those words, but the kind of promise that lives in the way you behave towards someone, in the way you never say no, in the way you answer on the first ring. I promised him that he would never have to struggle if I could prevent it. He met Renata 6 weeks after the funeral. I will always remember that detail, because at the time, I thought it was good timing. I thought it meant he would not be alone with his grief. She was confident, well-dressed, spoke quickly, and smiled slowly in the way that people do when they have learned that a slow smile looks more genuine than a fast one. She asked me at that first dinner what I had done with my superannuation, and I remember thinking it was an odd question for a first meeting, but deciding she was probably just making conversation. Callum moved in with her 4 months later. They were renting a flat in Grey Lynn that cost more per week than my first mortgage payment. Callum called me that first month and said they were stretched a bit thin getting started and asked if I could help with the bond and first month in advance. I transferred $3,800 that afternoon. After that, the calls came every few months. Sometimes it was Callum, sometimes it was Renata, which I thought at the time was a sign that she felt comfortable with me, that she thought of me as family. She had a way of framing each request that made it sound like a temporary inconvenience rather than a pattern. It was always just until things settled. It was always just a one-off. The money flowed out of my accounts in amounts that felt manageable one at a time, but were considerable when viewed together. I did not view them together for a long time. 18 months after Callum and Renata moved in together, they announced they were getting married. I was genuinely happy about it. Callum called me from Renata's parents' place in Tauranga, where he had apparently just proposed on the deck overlooking the harbor, and he sounded lighter than he had in years. I told him I was proud of him. I told him Patricia would have been over the moon. The conversation about money came 3 days later. Not from Callum. From Renata. She called on a Wednesday evening and said she was so grateful that I was going to be part of their lives and that she hoped. I knew how much Callum loved me and valued my support. Then she said that they had been looking at venues and it was all quite overwhelming, and that Callum had mentioned I might be willing to help. I asked how much she had in mind. She said they had found a beautiful property in the Waitakere Ranges, fully catered, room for 120 guests, and the package came to $68,000 all up, including photographer and flowers and the overnight accommodation for the bridal party. I was quiet for a moment. Then I asked what Renata's parents were contributing. There was a short pause. She said that her parents were quite conservative with money, and that they had agreed to cover the rehearsal dinner and the wedding cake, which she said was a lovely gesture. Then she said they were hoping I might be able to cover the rest, since I had more flexibility, and since Callum was my only child, and this would be such a meaningful contribution to their future. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 2 days. I thought about Callum, driving down every second weekend when Patricia was sick. I thought about the way he had stood at the graveside and not spoken, and how that silence had communicated something that words would have ruined. I thought about the promise I had made to him without making it. I called Renata back and said yes. The payments went out over the following 8 months in installments, as each vendor required their deposit and then their balance. I kept records because I am an engineer, and that is what I do. By the time the final florist invoice cleared, I had paid $69,400, slightly more than the original estimate, because Renata had upgraded the catering package 3 months in and added a string quartet for the ceremony, without mentioning it to me until the invoice arrived. The wedding itself was beautiful. I will not pretend otherwise. The way to care ranges at dusk are something that photographs cannot entirely capture. The guests were kind. The food was excellent. I was seated at table 9. I want to make sure that detail lands properly. I had paid $69,000 for this wedding. I had spent 8 months handling invoices, managing transfers, answering questions from venues about payment schedules because Renata said admin gave her anxiety. And on the day itself, I was seated at table 9 with Callum's primary school friend and his wife, a cousin of Renata's from Napier, who spent the entire reception on her phone, and 2 colleagues of Renata's whom I had never met. Renata's parents sat at table 1 with the bridal party. I found out about my table assignment when I arrived, and collected my name card from the seating display by the entrance. My name was written in the same font as everyone else's. Raymond Ashford. Table 9. I stood there in front of that display for longer than I should have. A woman behind me needed to find her own name, and I apologized and stepped aside. During the speeches, Renata's father spoke about the wedding cake he and his wife had arranged. He said they had wanted to give the young couple a sweet foundation for their life together. The room applauded. Callum smiled at him from the bridal table. I clapped too. I was not going to be the father who made a scene at his son's wedding, but I drove home that night on the motorway, with the windows down and the Auckland night air coming in cold. And I thought about what it meant that I had just attended my own son's wedding as a guest. The call about the house came 6 weeks later. Callum and Renata were still renting in Grey Lynn. The lease was coming up, and the landlord had indicated he wanted to sell, which meant they would need to find somewhere new. Renata had been looking at properties in Mount Albert and had found one she described as perfect. 3 bedrooms, good bones, excellent school zone. The only issue was the price. I listened to her describe the property for about 4 minutes before she arrived at the point. The vendor wanted $840,000. Callum and Renata had been approved for a mortgage, but were short on the deposit by a significant amount. They needed $112,000. I told her I did not have that amount liquid without selling something. She said she understood. And then she said that Callum had been thinking and wondering whether I might consider something different. She paused, the way she always paused, before the significant part. She said that I was rattling around in a 4-bedroom house alone, and that perhaps I might consider transferring the title to Callum with a lifetime tenancy arrangement so that I could continue living there as long as I wished, and they would take on the rates and maintenance, and in exchange, I would give them a lump sum of $43,000 to renovate and bring the property up to their needs. I said I needed time to consider that. I need to stop here for a moment and be honest about something. I am an engineer. I have spent my entire working life running calculations, checking load tolerances, refusing to sign off on structures that had not been properly verified. And yet I sat with this proposal for 3 weeks, and I did not do the calculation that mattered most. I did not sit down with my bank statements and add up what I had already given them. Instead, I thought about Callum. I thought about the fact that the house had 4 bedrooms, and I only used one of them. I thought about Patricia's garden, which I had been maintaining as though she might come back to check on it. And I thought about how Patricia always said that a house is just walls and a roof, and that the people inside it are what make it worth anything. I signed the transfer documents on a Tuesday morning in October. The renovation work began 3 weeks later. I had agreed to pay $43,000. The invoices came to me for payment because Renata said it made more sense since the contractors were used to dealing with me and I had the engineering background to verify the work. The final total was $43,800, and I paid it without question, because $800 seemed like a small thing after everything else. What I did not know until much later was that the renovation had included a complete refit of the master bedroom ensuite that had not been in the original scope, and that the materials selected were considerably above the mid-range specification I had been quoted. What I also did not know was that Renata had already begun conversations with a real estate agent. I found out about the sale in the worst possible way. My neighbor from across the street, a retired postman named Derek, who had lived on the road for 26 years, came over on a Saturday morning and knocked on my door with a look on his face that I recognized as the expression of someone who does not want to be the person delivering news, but believes you deserve to hear it from a friend. He had seen a listing online, 3 bedrooms, Mount Albert, seeking offers over $1,100,000. The photos were of my house, my kitchen, the garden that Patricia and I had planted together the year Callum started secondary school. I thanked Derek. I closed the door. I sat down at the kitchen table. The lifetime tenancy arrangement was in the transfer documents. I had signed them, but I had not had a solicitor review them before signing, because Callum was my son, and Renata had prepared the paperwork, and I had trusted that the word arrangement meant something. I went to my home office and opened the filing cabinet where I keep every document I have ever signed. The transfer paperwork was there, in a manila folder. I read it for the first time with the careful attention I should have given it 14 months earlier. The phrase, lifetime tenancy, did not appear anywhere in the document. I called Callum. He answered on the 4th ring. I told him what Derek had shown me. There was a long pause. Then he said that Renata had been looking at options and that the market had moved and that they might be able to get something better suited to them if they freed up some equity, and that it was just preliminary at this stage. I asked him where I was supposed to live. He said they had been thinking about that and there were some really nice retirement villages in the area, and that Renata had actually looked into a few and thought they seemed very well set up for someone at my stage of life. I was 63 years old. I had never used the phrase retirement village in relation to myself. I had been planning to use the equity in my home to supplement my pension for the next 20 years. I set the phone down without saying goodbye. Then I sat in the kitchen of the house. My wife and I had bought together in 1997, and I did the calculation I should have done years earlier. I got my banking app, and I went back 4 years, which was as far back as the app showed, and I began adding up every transfer I had made to Callum and Renata, the flat bond, the various bridging amounts, Renata's attempt at a wellness product business that she had asked me to invest $8,000 in and which had generated no returns and closed after 11 months, the wedding, the renovation, smaller transfers of $500, $1,000, $1,500, $3,200, for what Renata had described as an unexpected tax bill. The total, not including the house itself, came to $116,000, and now they were selling my house. I opened my laptop and searched for property lawyers in Auckland. I called the first one, whose website said they specialized in residential and family property disputes. Her name was Miriam Chan. Her assistant gave me an appointment for the following Tuesday. I did not sleep well that week. I sat in the evenings in the conservatory that Patricia had insisted on adding when we renovated in 2008, watching the light change over the garden. I found her old gardening notebook on the shelf beside the seed packets, the one where she had mapped out each bed and noted what she planted and when. The handwriting was her ordinary handwriting, slightly rushed because she was always doing 3 things at once. I read it from cover to cover, without quite meaning to. At the back, in the section she had labeled notes, there were a few pages that had nothing to do with gardening. The first one that stopped me was from about 3.5 years earlier, roughly 2 months before she was diagnosed. She had written, "Renata asked Raymond again tonight about the KiwiSaver balance. He doesn't see it. I don't know how to tell him what I think I see, without sounding like the jealous mother-in-law. Callum is happy, and that is real. I just wish I were more certain about her." 3 pages on. Another entry, dated about 6 weeks later. She called today, while Callum was at work, and asked me, in the nicest possible way, what our estate plans were. She said she asked because she wanted to make sure Callum was taken care of. I said, "We had a will." She asked who the executor was. I changed the subject. I didn't tell Raymond. I sat with that notebook for a long time. Patricia had seen it. From nearly the beginning she had seen it. And she had said nothing, because she loved Callum, and she did not want to be the thing that broke what he had found after grief. That was who she was. She absorbed difficult things quietly and waited for them to resolve themselves. This one had not resolved itself, and she had not been here to see it. I kept my appointment with Miriam Chan. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Shortland Street, with a view of the car park next door and a rubber plant by the window that appeared to have been thriving for about a decade. She was in her mid-40s, direct in the way that Auckland lawyers tend to be when they have too many clients and not enough hours, but with enough patience to let me tell the full story before she started taking notes. When I finished, she looked at the transfer documents for a while without speaking. Then she said, "The good news is that the absence of a documented tenancy agreement is a significant legal problem for them, not for you. The property was transferred on the basis of an arrangement that was clearly represented to you as including lifetime occupancy. That representation, even if not formally documented, gives us a basis to challenge the sale." I asked what the bad news was. She said, "The bad news is that recovering your monetary contributions is more complicated. Gifts are generally not recoverable unless you can demonstrate they were made on the basis of false or misleading representations. But given the pattern here, the escalating amounts, the investment in Renata's failed business, the renovation expenses, the house transfer, there is a reasonable argument that you were operating under a sustained misrepresentation about the nature of this relationship and your position in it." She leaned forward. "The first step is an injunction to stop the sale while we establish your occupancy rights, that we can move on quickly. The second step is a full claim that sets out the pattern of financial conduct. Your son and his wife will not like either of those things. There is a chance that the injunction alone will bring them to the table." I told her to file it. She nodded and picked up her pen. Then she set it down again and looked at me directly. "I want to ask you one thing before we proceed. Is there any chance that your son did not understand the full nature of what Renata was doing? Is it possible he believed you were genuinely consenting to all of this?" I thought about Callum at the wedding smiling at Renata's father. I thought about the way he had always spoken on the phone with a certain flatness, as if he were reporting rather than initiating. I thought about the boy who had driven down every second weekend in the rain. I said, "I think my son has been telling himself a story in which everything is fine because believing otherwise would be too hard. I do not think he is malicious. I think he is complicit." Miriam wrote something down. Noted, she said. The injunction was served 3 days later. Callum called that same afternoon, and I let it go to voicemail. Renata called twice. I let both go. What I heard in Callum's voicemail, when I finally listened, was not anger. It was something closer to confusion. The kind that happens when someone has been so thoroughly convinced of one version of events that encountering another version feels like a disruption of physics. He said, "Dad, what is happening? Can you just call me?" I did not call him. Not that day. What I did instead was something I had not done since Patricia passed. I called my brother Warren, who lived in Tauranga, and whom I had been avoiding for about 2 years, because Warren had never liked Renata, and I had found his directness about it difficult to hear. Warren is 3 years older than me and retired early from a career in commercial fishing and has the particular bluntness of a man who has spent many years arguing with the weather. He listened to the whole thing without speaking. Then he said, "Ray, I want you to know that I am not going to say I told you so. I am going to say that I am coming up on Friday, and you are going to feed me properly, and we are going to sort this out." He was there by noon on Friday with a chilly bin of fish and enough opinions for both of us. The formal hearing on the injunction was 4 weeks later. Miriam had prepared a detailed affidavit documenting the transfer arrangement, the renovation payments, and the financial history going back as far as I could reconstruct. She had also found a legal aid for elder financial exploitation through a community law referral, a woman named Grace Typine, who worked out of an office in Henderson, and who spoke with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen this specific situation a considerable number of times. Grace joined our case as a supporting advisor. She said that what I was describing, sustained financial requests from an adult child and their partner, escalating in scale, culminating in an asset transfer obtained without proper independent legal advice, was a recognized pattern under New Zealand elder abuse frameworks, and that there were remedies available that most people in my position did not know existed. I had not thought of myself as a person in a recognizable position. I had thought of myself as a father who had made poor decisions. Grace said, "Those two things are not mutually exclusive, but the pattern of conduct directed toward you is what matters legally. Your decisions were made in a context that was deliberately constructed. That is not the same as simply making poor decisions." Hearing that said plainly did something I did not entirely expect. It did not make me feel vindicated. It made me feel sad in a different way than I had been feeling sad. A sadness that had more air in it. I went back through the transfer documents with Miriam's guidance and found that the property title had been transferred under a process that the Land Information Office would later describe as irregular in several procedural respects. The transfer had been processed without the standard independent advice certificate that is required when a party is transferring significant assets to a family member who has an interest in the outcome. Renata had handled the paperwork directly through an online conveyancing service rather than through a solicitor instructed by me. Miriam said that was not an accident. Derek came forward without being asked. He wrote a statutory declaration stating that Renata had spoken to him over the fence 3 weeks before the listing went live and had told him they were thinking of selling and moving to a bigger property in the North Shore. She had mentioned nothing about me. She had not mentioned where I would be going, Derek said in his declaration. I asked her directly what Raymond's plans were. She said he was flexible. I did not know what that meant at the time. Looking back, I believe it meant she had not told him. I did not feel pleasure reading that. I felt the specific tiredness that comes from having something you already suspected confirmed in writing. The judge granted the injunction. The property could not be sold while proceedings were ongoing. Renata's lawyer filed a response that argued the property transfer had been freely given and that I was acting out of resentment toward my daughter-in-law. The document contained several characterizations of my behavior that were difficult to read. Miriam had warned me they would do this. She had said, "When people cannot dispute the facts, they dispute the character of the person presenting them. You need to be prepared for that." I was prepared for it. Being prepared did not make it easy. What helped was the gardening notebook. I read it again the night before the full hearing, and I thought about Patricia sitting in the conservatory, seeing things she could not say, carrying a worry she had not wanted to place on my shoulders, while she still could. I thought about how much of her energy in her last years had gone into managing everyone else's emotions rather than her own. She would not have wanted me to do that. The hearing itself took most of a morning. The courtroom was not dramatic. It was fluorescent and functional, and smelled faintly of carpet cleaner. Callum sat on the other side with Renata and their lawyer. He did not look at me when I came in. Renata looked at me once, briefly, with an expression that was entirely controlled. Miriam presented the full documentation, the financial history, the transfer irregularities, Derek's declaration, Patricia's notebook entries, which Miriam had included as evidence of the long-standing nature of the pattern. Grace provided supporting context on recognized patterns of elder financial exploitation. Then I spoke. I said, "I transferred this property to my son because I believed I was giving something to my family. I believed I was supported by an arrangement that would allow me to remain in the home. Patricia and I built together for the rest of my life. That arrangement was described to me clearly and repeatedly and does not appear in the documents I signed. I am not here because I regret being generous to my son. I am here because what was done was not generosity. It was extraction." The judge was a methodical man in his early 60s who made notes throughout and asked precise questions. When Renata's lawyer made the resentment argument, the judge said, "What I am looking at is a documented financial history and a property transfer conducted without independent legal advice. Resentment or its absence is not relevant to that analysis. The outcome was not immediate. These things never are." What the judge ordered at that stage was a full independent review of the transfer and a mediation process to attempt resolution before any final determination. The property remained injuncted. Renata left 2 weeks later. Callum called me on a Sunday evening, and when I answered, he was sitting somewhere quiet. I could hear nothing in the background except him breathing. He said, "She's gone, Dad. Left on Friday. She took her car and her clothes and whatever was in the joint account." I sat down. "I've been sitting here for 2 days trying to work out how to call you," he said. "I don't know where to start." I said, "Then start anywhere." He talked for a long time, not in excuses, which I had been bracing for, more in the stumbling retrospective way that people talk when they are finally allowing themselves to see something they had been walking alongside for years without looking at it directly. He said he had told himself that the requests were reasonable because Renata always had an explanation and the explanations always sounded sensible. He said he had told himself that the wedding seating was a logistical decision and not what it looked like. He said he had told himself the house thing was genuinely in my interest because it freed up capital and reduced maintenance. He said, "I think I needed to believe those things because believing anything else meant admitting something about what I had been part of. And I couldn't, not while I was still in it." I did not tell him about Patricia's notebook. Not that night. That felt like something to do in person, when there was more space around it. I said, "I know, son. I know it wasn't simple." We talked until quite late. About his mother. About what he wanted his life to look like, now that he was having to build an answer to that question from the ground up. About whether he wanted to come back to Auckland or stay in Hamilton or do something else entirely. Before we hung up, I said, "Come up next weekend. Warren is talking about visiting again. It'll be good." He came. He and Warren argued cheerfully about rugby for most of Saturday, and I made a roast that Patricia would have considered acceptable. In the evening, we sat in the conservatory and Callum asked if he could look at the garden notebook. I handed it to him and let him read it in his own time. He was quiet for a long while. When he got to the entries at the back, he said, "She saw it." I said, "She saw a lot of things she kept to herself because she loved you." He set the notebook down carefully on the table, the way you set down something that has weight beyond its physical dimensions. The mediation concluded 3 months later. The transfer was voided, and the property returned to my name on the basis of the irregularities in the conveyancing process and the undocumented tenancy representations. The renovation costs were not fully recovered. That was the realistic outcome Miriam had prepared me for, but a portion was acknowledged as part of the settlement. Renata did not attend the mediation. Her lawyer appeared alone and settled fairly quickly, which Miriam said told its own story about how strong they believed their position to be. In the months after that, my life changed in ways that were quieter than I had expected them to be. I did not sell the house. I had thought I might, after everything, but when it came to it, I found that I did not want to. Patricia's garden was still there. The conservatory was still there. The letterbox I had installed on a Saturday morning was still there. These things were not the same as Patricia, but they were the record of a life built carefully and with intention. And I found that I wanted to remain inside that record for a while longer. I took on a part-time consulting role with a small engineering firm that did residential assessments. 2 days a week, enough to keep my mind occupied, and my professional registration current. I found that I had missed the work more than I had admitted to myself during retirement. Derek and I started having coffee on Wednesday mornings, which was something we had talked about for 2 years without organizing. We walked down to the cafe on the corner and argued about things that did not matter and talked about things that did. Callum and I spoke on the phone every week, sometimes more. The conversations were not always easy. There were things that needed to be said in pieces over time rather than all at once, and we were both learning how to do that. But there was something in those calls that had not been there for a long time, a directness, an absence of management, the feeling that we were actually talking to each other rather than to the version of each other we had been maintaining. He came down most months. Sometimes he helped in the garden. He was not especially good at it, but he was willing, which Patricia always said was the more important quality. One evening in late autumn, I stood on the back step with a cup of tea, watching the light drop over the garden, and I thought about what Patricia had written in that notebook. "I hope I am wrong about her." 4 words that had taken 4 years to fully arrive. She had not been wrong, and I had not been stupid, which is the thing people always want to decide when they hear a story like this. I had been trusting. I had been grieving. I had been doing what fathers do, or what I believed fathers do, which is show up without conditions and absorb whatever is required. What I know now that I did not know then is that showing up without conditions is only generosity if the other person understands what they are receiving. If they do not, or worse, if they do and have decided to treat it as extraction, then unconditional showing up is not love. It is an arrangement, and arrangements should have terms. My name is Raymond Ashford. I am 63 years old. I spent 4 years saying yes to everything and asking for nothing, and believing that this was what good fathers did. What I have learned is this: generosity is not measured by how much you give. It is measured by whether what you give is received with honesty. When someone accepts your money, your home, your patience, and your trust, without telling you what they actually intend, that is not a relationship. That is a transaction you did not know you were in. There is a difference between a child who needs help and a child who has learned that asking will always work. The first is something a parent can genuinely answer. The second is something a parent must decline, not out of hardness, but because unlimited access to rescue does not teach anyone to swim. If you are a parent reading this and something in it sounds familiar, the escalating requests, the gradual normalization, the sense that saying no would mean you had failed somehow, then hear this. The love is real. The exploitation, if that is what it is also real. Both things can be true at once, and only one of them is your responsibility. You are allowed to have terms. You are allowed to require that arrangements be put in writing. You are allowed to call a solicitor before you sign something. You are allowed to say, "I love you," and the answer is no. Setting those limits is not what breaks a family. What breaks a family is when the people who should protect each other decide instead to extract from each other. Limits are not walls. They are the conditions under which something real can actually grow. I know that now. I learned it later than I should have. But I learned it. And I am still here, in my house, in my garden, with my son, making something from what is left. That is enough.